Chapter 15. A Penguin with Horns. The President's estate was located at the far end of a sprawling grass field, along which several rows of suburban houses were positioned. Alan hadn't said much since they'd left the building, but now, standing at the iron gate of the mansion, he broke the silence. "President Brisk is a very important man. If he wants to see you, he has a reason." He looked at Jack meaningfully as he slammed his palm against a square button on the gatepost. In response, the gate clicked, and there was a motorized grinding sound as it began to swing inward. A steel falcon insignia at the center of the gate was divided in half as it opened. "Which is what?" Jack asked. After the penguin's impressive display this morning, and the cold glare with which he had fixed the dough, Jack was very nervous about meeting the President. Alan stepped through the open gate, and Jack followed. "I've gotten to know President Brisk very well over the past 2 years," Alan said. "He is brilliant and powerful. He wastes no time and doesn't like being lied to." He paused briefly, but before Jack could respond, he started again. "Dr. Walraven died in a house fire. A tragic accident. You weren't there." "Yes, I was," Jack protested. His blood had immediately boiled at the words. "You haven't asked me anything about Dr. Walraven's death, except to imply that I should have saved him. And now you're going to say it was only an accident? I was there, Alan. We were attacked." "You're not hearing me, Jack," Alan said, stopping the bunny with a paw to his chest. "It was an accident. You saw nothing. You saw nobody." Jack started. "After the mill burnt down, you came here to find me." He began walking again. "I am your new legal guardian, after all," he added coldly. The cobblestone driveway curved around a large oak tree before the biggest, nicest house Jack had ever seen. 3 stories tall, every window and door wrapped in stone arches. Construction scaffolding hid the entire left side of the house. The exterior seemed to be going through a remodel. The wooden double doors were as tall as the one the elephant had passed through in Alan's building. Medium and smaller doors were carved into them. Alan lifted a fist toward the door, looking at Jack. "Remember," he started. "I saw nothing, I saw nobody," Jack muttered. The words felt like a betrayal as they came out of his mouth. "Nothing and nobody," Alan agreed, and he rapped on the door. There was silence for a moment. Then a lock clicked, and the inset door on the right creaked open, slowly at first. The pleasant but quizzical face of a bespectacled penguin peered out. She eyed Jack first, looking him up and down, and then spotted the fox. "Alan!" she said, and pulled the door wide. "Back so soon! That business this morning, that could have been a disaster." "Hello, Mrs. Brisk," he replied. "Yes, it could have, but all is well now, as I understand it." He ushered Jack forward. "This is Jack Roberts. You might say he's my kid brother. Jack, this is Mrs. Dulcinea Brisk, the First Lady of Animal Control." "Hello, Jack," she said as she extended a flipper toward him. Never having met a penguin in person before, he reached forward uncertainly and pinched the end of the flipper between his fingers. "Alan is always so formal," she laughed. "Please, come in." It must have been 20 degrees cooler inside. Appropriate for penguins, he considered. The cylindrical entryway was nearly all marble, with pillars that stretched up to a high ceiling from which a crystal chandelier was suspended, adding dramatically to the icy feel of the space. A large painting of a squat, stern-looking bull rested on the floor next to a fireplace, glowering out upon the room with a furrowed brow. To the left of the mantel, a stairwell of deep mahogany curved up to the second floor. Mrs. Brisk shut the door behind them, then turned and pressed the tips of her flippers together. "Alexander is in a meeting right now, and, well," she paused, as if biting back her words. "Ah, is Mr. Gordon here, then?" Alan asked. Mrs. Brisk looked about her distractedly. "Yes," she said, picking up a half-empty water glass from the mantel and dusting below it with the blade of her flipper. "He arrived with his assistant about 15 minutes ago, just after Alexander returned. I think there's quite enough for Alexander to be dealing with today. And what that man expects him to do about... Well, anyway, they should be finishing up soon. Why don't you boys just... She laughed dismissively as she touched Alan's paw. You know where you're going, don't you? She tittered. Alan thanked her, then ushered Jack to the mahogany stairway. The stairs opened into a long, narrow hall. A door at the end was slightly ajar, spilling blue daylight across the dark wood floor. As they drew nearer, Jack could hear a deep voice from behind the door.
Don't have the resources to investigate it ourselves. This is the fourth one, Mr. President. It's not an isolated incident. It's...
I understand your situation, Mr. Gordon,
said a second voice, which Jack recognized as that of President Brisk.
But I'm afraid this matter does not fall under the Protection Agreement of Animal Control. It's a matter for your local police to handle.
The police? But surely this is...
I'm sorry, Pontificus.
Brisk cut across him.
But there is nothing more I can do for you. There really is nothing else to be said.
There was the sound of a chair scraping across the wood, and Brisk continued.
I truly am sorry, old friend.
As am I.
The deep voice responded, and another chair was moved across the floor. The door opened abruptly, and a tall hawk entered the hall, stopping short at the sight of the fox and bunny. Just behind him followed a gangly white wolf with a stooped posture. Jack took a step back instinctively, but the wolf's mannerism was so meek he relaxed immediately. This wolf was the wrong color anyway, he considered.
Oh, hello, Alan,
the hawk said, his tone instantly warm. Hello, Mr. Gordon, Alan responded. How was your flight?
Long,
the hawk said.
And boy are my wings tired.
2 years later, it's still not funny, Alan said, although he betrayed a smile. The hawk sighed.
Oh, well, one day you'll develop a sense of humor. I intend to be a witness.
He chuckled, then turned to Jack.
And who is this?
Mr. Gordon, this is Jack Roberts, Alan said. Adopted son of Dr. Walraven. Jack, this is Pontificus Gordon. Mr. Gordon holds a similar position to my own. He is assistant to Lady Claythorne in Safehaven.
I'm merely her gopher,
Mr. Gordon said with a wink.
But adopted son of Dr. Walraven, you say? My dear boy, I've only just heard of your loss. My deepest sympathies.
Wondering how he could already know about Dr. Walraven, Jack nodded uncertainly. Thank you.
Dr. Walraven was a fine rat, a hero above nearly all others. This will only add to the bad news I must bring back to her ladyship. Good day to you both, Mr. Gordon said. Peter, come along, he added, and the wolf followed him to the stairs.
Alan rapped on the doorframe with the back of his paw.
Hello again, Alan,
the penguin said, standing as they entered.
Yes, Carla told me you had a visitor this morning. This must be Jack.
He fixed his eyes on the bunny and stepped around the desk.
Yes, sir, Alan nodded. This is Jack Roberts. Jack, I'm sure you already know who this is. It's a pleasure to meet you, son, Brisk said.
To Jack's great relief, he did not extend a flipper. Pleasure to meet you too, sir, Jack half mumbled.
I returned through the north gate this morning, the president explained, leaning a hip against the edge of his desk. Carla tells me you brought some rather terrible news along with you.
He paused, perhaps waiting for Jack to respond. Jack managed a small nod. A house fire.
A house fire, he said, disbelieving. Were you there? Did you see anything?
Jack didn't respond immediately. He looked sideways at Alan, who did not meet his eyes. No, sir, he said finally. I wasn't there. The penguin clicked his tongue, shaking his head regretfully.
I'm very sorry, Jack. He was a great friend of mine, and a true inspiration to us all. Alan, Brisk looked to the fox, I'll need a word with you. Excuse us, Jack. Please take a seat.
He placed a flipper around Alan's shoulder, and the two left the room, shutting the door behind them. Jack dropped into a chair before the desk, his eyes wandering around the office. Several stacks of cardboard boxes filled one corner. The walls were empty, with several different paint swatches brushed here and there, as though President Brisk were in the process of selecting a wall color. Another cardboard box was sitting on the president's desk, alongside a gold-trimmed carriage clock, and on top of that was a golden letter opener. A letter opener. Jack looked over his shoulder. The faint voices of Allen and Brisk could be heard just outside, deep in conversation. He lifted the strap of the messenger bag over his head and withdrew the brown paper package. He considered the word written in the upper left corner. Stronger. Whatever was in this box, it was meant to protect Nikesha from the possibility of the stolen key falling into the wrong paws. What could possibly be stronger than King's High Tenna? And why was that same word painted onto the wall above the defaced animal control logo? There was so much tape, piercing it took some effort, but after short work he managed to slice an eye shape into the top edges of the box. Heart pounding, he looked over his shoulder again. The conversation didn't seem to be slowing. He slid a paw into the opening and fished around in the bed of foam peanuts. His fingers brushed a solid object, small and slender. It was cool as steel and about the size of a pen. He withdrew it. What could possibly be stronger than King's High Tenna? Jack had asked. What could protect the world from that key falling into the wrong paws? And here was the answer, resting on his open palm as he stared at it in disbelief. Nothing. It wasn't a safeguard from the key falling into the wrong paws. It was the key itself. Allen and Brisk seemed to be ending their conversation outside. As quickly as he could, he stuffed the key into his pants pocket. The door began to open. The box! He'd nearly dropped it in his scuffle to hide the key. He threw open the flap of his bag and stuffed the box inside. "My apologies," Brisk said as he re-entered the room. "My schedule is quite full today, as I'm sure you can imagine." Jack grunted, forcing a grin and folding his paws over the messenger bag on his lap. "We nearly lost an entire ship full of potential recruits. Children, I should say," he added. He paused for a moment, then turned his eyes to Jack as he dropped into his own chair behind the desk. "You know, if that deer hadn't come forward, I might have thought you had caused it all." Jack's heart leapt. Was this why he had been brought here? Was he somehow in trouble? I saw that ship plowing through the pier, a deck full of mannequins and one bunny running around like a martyred chicken," he considered Jack. "Then that deer came forward. What a way to make an entrance," he said with a soft laugh. Jack smiled stiffly. "What I find remarkable," Brisk continued, "was that you were the only one unaffected by her High Tenna. The only one." He emphasized the word, almost accusingly. "Could it be," he said, tilting his head with curiosity, "that you possess the fabled luck of your species?" Jack shrugged. "Dr. Walraven always thought so. I don't know, though." "Einer thought so, did he?" Brisk asked, raising a brow. Jack remembered how Dr. Walraven had felt about Brisk, and wondered whether the feeling was mutual. "Well," the president said finally, swiveling toward the bay window behind him, "Einer was a very wise man. I'm quite sure he was right in this matter. What else could explain it?" Jack watched the back of the president's chair, wondering if he had somehow offended him. Then the chair swiveled around, and Jack was surprised to see tears welling in his eyes. "Dr. Walraven was someone I respected greatly," he said. "His death has, well, it's been a punch in the gut, to be frank. We had our differences, it's true. But then what true friends haven't?" He coughed, smiled at Jack, and continued. "Still, it's the things we regret that we remember the clearest, isn't it? Last time I saw him, I called him a—" He paused, then finished in a tone of self-loathing. "A raving rodent. Suppose I'll live with that forever." This confession from the stern, intimidating president took Jack by surprise. After Alan's cold indifference, the president's words felt, well, a lot like a hug. "Yeah," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I know exactly what you mean. He'd wanted to go somewhere. Pine Creek, I think, and he'd wanted me to go with him. I was mad about something stupid, and I threw it all in his face." His eyes burned with unfallen tears, the first tears since the attack, and he buried his face in his paws. "Oh, Jack." Brisk rose from his seat and stepped again around his desk. He rested a fin on the bunny's shoulder. "He knew how you felt. He knew you loved him." "I told him to stop calling me son," Jack said, his voice cracking. It felt strange to be so emotionally exposed in front of someone so important, someone he'd only just met, but now that the words were coming, they seemed to flow effortlessly. "It wasn't until he was gone that I understood how much that word meant to me." "That's how it always is, my boy," Brisk said. "We never realize what we have until we've lost it." Tears came in earnest now, and it was only by an effort that Jack choked back a sob. Brisk smiled encouragingly, then turned toward the stack of cardboard boxes in the corner. "I have a picture here, somewhere." As Brisk dug through the boxes, Jack slid a paw into his pocket, gripping the bronze key. Dr. Walraven had been so distrustful of President Brisk, enough, apparently, to somehow steal this key. And yet here Brisk was, more encouraging and kind than anyone had been to Jack since the doctor's death. Surely he could be trusted. "Ah!" Brisk exclaimed, stooping to reach into one of the lower boxes. "Here it is." He stepped back over to Jack, holding out a small, unframed photograph. It depicted a slightly younger Dr. Walraven standing near, but not next to, President Brisk. A third figure, a tall lizard with pinkish-white scales in stark contrast to his black tuxedo, stood between them. The three of them held up champagne glasses in an apparent toast toward the camera. "I want you to have this," Brisk said. With his free paw, Jack reached for the photograph, but just as his fingers brushed the president's fin, there was a sudden shift. A hideous change had come over the president. The black feathers of his face had become sparse, patched, exposing white skin beneath. His eyes sunk back into his skull, leaving only empty sockets, and from his temples a pair of enormous black horns had sprouted, so large they seemed unsupportable.
"I need more power!"
the demonically transfigured president shrilled, leaning toward Jack.
"Red teeth! Red teeth! Red teeth!"
Jack tumbled over the back of his chair. He scrambled to his feet, his arms wrapped around his head defensively. But the only sound he heard was the gentle ticking of the carriage clock. He opened his eyes, but instead of the rancorous perversion of President Brisk, he now saw only the bewildered penguin, perfectly whole, staring back at him. Brisk's look was half appraising, half concerned. After a moment he spoke. "It's only a picture," he said, his tone reassuring. "I apologize if it upset you." Still half crouching, Jack looked around the room. The clock continued to tick. He rose slowly. No," he said. "I'm fine. I just lost my balance." It was a lame story, but Brisk nodded. "Well, in any case," Brisk said, looking at the carriage clock on his desk, "I hope you will forgive my abruptness, but I do have matters to which I must attend." He smiled, took a step toward the door, and then paused. "I have an idea," he said. "Why don't you accompany me to the trials today?" Still shaken, Jack hesitated, but Brisk now stood between him and the door, and he found it impossible to say no. "Sure," he said finally. Thinking to save face, he added, perhaps a little too enthusiastically, "That sounds great." "Wonderful," Brisk nodded. All signs of misgiving faded. "Well then, let's be on our way."